Story 1. The Passenger. The night weighed heavily on the lone stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. Bob Big Rig Mitchell, a seasoned trucker with a reputation for fearlessness, pushed his 18-wheeler forward through the obsidian void. His truck's engine roared, a familiar lullaby that usually accompanied him on these desolate roads. Bob had faced his share of eerie stories and supernatural legends throughout his years on the road. He scoffed at ghost stories and dismissed urban legends as truck stop chatter, but that night would change everything. As his truck rumbled down the empty road, Bob's keen eyes spotted something in the distance, just at the edge of his headlight's reach. At first he thought it was just a trick of the night, but the image became more defined as he drew nearer. A woman, standing alone on the road, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Bob's heart quickened, and he eased off the gas, slowing his rig as he approached the mysterious figure. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but a deep-rooted sense of responsibility for fellow travelers urged him to check if she needed help. He rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her hair concealing her features like a curtain of shadows. Bob's unease grew, but he couldn't bring himself to drive past her without at least making sure she was okay. He put his truck in park and climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Ma'am, do you need any assistance?" he asked again, his voice wavering. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing piercing, somewhat luminescent eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips cracked and dry. She stared at Bob with an intensity that made his hair stand on end. "I need a ride," she whispered, her voice hollow and haunting. Bob hesitated for a moment, his rational mind screaming at him to get back in the truck and drive away. But against his better judgment, he opened the passenger door and motioned for her to climb in. The woman seemed to almost levitate into the cab, her cold presence sending a chill through the confined space. Bob's heart pounded as he slid back into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of the unsettling situation. "Where are you headed?" Bob finally asked, breaking the eerie silence that had settled in the cab. "Home," the woman replied, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. Bob's anxiety intensified. He knew there was no town or house for miles around, just the desolate road stretching into the unknown. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they continued down the dark highway, the woman's presence seemed to cast a malevolent shadow over the truck. Bob's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had changed his mind and wanted to send her out, to leave her on the side of the road, but fear kept him silent. Suddenly, the woman spoke again, her voice chillingly clear this time. "You shouldn't have stopped for me, Bob." Bob's heart stopped. How did she know his name? He stole a glance at her and her eyes met his, glowing with an unsettling knowingness. "Who are you?" Bob demanded, his voice trembling. She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "I'm the reason you'll never stop for another person ever again." Before Bob could react, her form began to change, shifting and warping until she was nothing but an amorphous, shadowy mass. Terror coursed through him as he realized he had picked up something inhuman, something that defied all reason. The truck swerved wildly as Bob struggled to maintain control. He could hear her sinister laughter echoing in his mind as the world around him twisted and distorted. The truck seemed to take on a life of its own and careened off the road and into the darkness, its headlights fading into oblivion. The next morning, a passing trucker discovered the wreckage. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of Bob Mitchell. The police launched an investigation, and initially had little answers. 2 days later, Bob was found miles away from the wreckage, disoriented and disheveled. When the authorities located him, he was sitting by the side of the road, staring blankly into the distance. When he finally came to his senses, Bob recounted the story of the woman, her haunting presence, and the malevolent force that had seemed to possess his truck. But when asked about the 2 days following the crash, his memory was an impenetrable void. He couldn't recall how he had ended up miles away from the wreckage, or what had transpired during that time. In the years that followed, Bob's story became a legend among truckers and travelers. The highway, a lifeline for those who traversed it, now took on an air of mystery and uncertainty. Bob himself grappled with the events of that night. No one could provide answers to the lingering questions. Why had he been found so far from the wreckage, and what had transpired during the days that had slipped through his consciousness like grains of sand through an hourglass? The answers, it seems, will forever lie with the passenger, in the unknown. Story 2. There's something in here with me. The following is a tale that I experienced as a young man. It was a weekend like any other, or so I thought. My parents were headed out of town for a short trip, leaving me alone at home. I was a 14-year-old boy, and the idea of having the whole house to myself for a couple of days was incredibly exciting. My parents left on Friday morning, promising to be back by Sunday evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that first night alone, I settled into my bed with a feeling of independence and freedom. I immersed myself in a movie marathon, indulging in junk food and reveling in the sense of being in charge. Around midnight, my eyelids grew heavy, and I finally succumbed to sleep. A chill in the air awoke me. I blinked, disoriented, as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a ghostly glow across my room. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves outside, and for a moment I just lay there, wrapped in a cozy blanket of silence. But then, something caught my attention. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps on carpet, reached my ears. My heart began to race as I realized I wasn't alone. Fear clawed at my chest, paralyzing me. I strained my eyes in the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A shape, indistinct yet undeniably present, standing near the foot of my bed. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stared at the creature. Its form was like something out of a nightmare, a contortion of something grotesque and hideous. Its eyes gleamed with an eerie, unnatural light. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but there was none that fit. This was no ordinary intruder. I summoned my courage and tried to speak, but my voice came out as a barely audible squeak. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, penetrating into the depths of my soul. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the bed, held captive by an inexplicable force. Then, the creature moved. It began to slink closer, its movements sinuous and otherworldly. Panic surged through me, a wild animal trapped in a corner. I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling in my haste. With trembling hands, I turned on the flashlight app, casting a beam of light into the darkness. The creature recoiled, as if the light itself was a weapon against it. The unearthly glow in its eyes wavered, and I could see it more clearly now. A twisted, nightmarish amalgamation of limbs and flesh. Its presence radiated malevolence, a force beyond my comprehension. I took a deep breath and mustered every ounce of courage I had left. With the flashlight fixed on the creature, I slowly edged towards the bedroom door. It seemed to grow more agitated, its movements jittery and unpredictable. As I reached the door, I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The moon hung above, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape. The adrenaline rush began to ebb, and a cold realization settled in. My home, my sanctuary, had been invaded by something inexplicable, something that defied the laws of reality. Feeling utterly helpless and not knowing what else to do, I fled to a friend's house, desperation urging my pounding fists against his door. The sudden noise startled everyone in the house, but their concern quickly turned to sympathy as they recognized my distress. Without hesitation, they welcomed me in, providing a haven where I could stay until my parents returned home. The remainder of the weekend was a blur. I stayed with the friend, too terrified to return home until my parents did. When they finally arrived on Sunday evening, I recounted the horrifying experience to them. They exchanged worried glances but offered little in the way of explanation. Years have gone by now, and the memory of that night still sends my heart into a pounding frenzy. I can never fully explain what I saw that night, but one thing that I believe for certain is that the darkness holds secrets, and sometimes, when you're alone and vulnerable, those secrets can come to visit, leaving you to grapple with the chilling reality that you are never truly alone in the dark. Story 3. There's something wrong with my sister. I can still remember it as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been decades. Halloween night in our small, quiet neighborhood was always a special occasion. The anticipation of dressing up and collecting candy was enough to make any kid's heart race with excitement. My story happened back in the late 90s. I was just a young boy back then, and my older sister had promised to take me trick-or-treating. Little did I know that this Halloween would terrify me for years to come. We headed out just as the sun was about to set, and I remember there being an electricity in the air. I guess part of it was excitement, and part of it was fear, because I was still a little boy, and could still get scared quite easily. My sister dressed as a witch, and had the entire outfit head to toe. She even had a witch's mask, with the pointy nose and everything. She held my hand tightly as we knocked on doors and yelled, "Trick or treat." We went door to door, and I scooped up as much candy as I could get my hands on. About 45 minutes in, we got separated for a brief moment. When I finally caught up to her, I asked her where she had been, but she just looked at me. I didn't think much of it, and grabbed her hand, and we continued going door to door for about 15 or 20 more minutes. As we continued trick-or-treating, something felt off about her. She wasn't speaking much, and her movements were just weird. Honestly, I thought maybe she saw somebody she didn't like, or saw a boy she did like with someone else or something. I honestly didn't know. When we returned home, she was still acting weird. My parents were in the garage handing out candy, so I ran up to them and showed them how much I had gathered. My sister just kind of stood around and didn't talk. My sister had always been full of energy, but something was up and she was eerily quiet. Her and I went inside and left my parents to finish up handing out candy. My sister moved slowly into the kitchen. I remember her taking really slow steps, and just looking around, it was so creepy. I went into the living room to tend to my candy. I was snacking away, just eating candy, when I asked my sister if she was ever going to take off her costume. At least take that hideous mask off. When I didn't get a response, I turned around and she was standing directly behind me, just staring at me, motionless. At this point, I was part creeped out and part annoyed. Part of me told me that she was really going the extra mile to creep me out, and the other part told me that something was really off. Just then I could hear some loud talking coming from the garage where my parents were. I turned back around, and a few seconds later they bolted through the door. Looking part terrified and part panicked, they looked at me and asked who was with me. I was confused, and gave them that kind of look like, "What are you talking about?" Just then, my sister, with her mask off, walked in behind them. My eyes got really wide and I was so confused. I turned around and whoever was behind me that I thought was my sister was gone. In the kitchen, the door that led to the backyard was wide open. My parents were in a panic and started searching all around the house. Whoever it was never found. What's even creepier is that we later found that a knife was missing from the knife block, and we were never able to find it. To this day, I tell myself that it really was just my sister, and she had just snuck out the back door and came around to the garage. But she swears it wasn't. She said that she lost me and couldn't find me, and so she just came home, and that's where she found me. There are still so many questions, though. If it wasn't my sister, who the hell was it and what were their intentions? If it wasn't her, how was it then that whoever it was could have had the same exact costume that my sister was wearing? Where in the hell did that knife go? As a grown man now, it's a mystery that still gives me chills to think about all these years later.
Story 4. We Were Stalked. The story I am about to tell happened to my friend Emily and me last summer in the Sam Houston National Forest in East Texas. Emily and I decided to go on a camping trip. We've been best friends since childhood, and our shared love for adventure and the great outdoors had brought us there. The reason for our camping trip was pretty simple. We needed a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. We both love the outdoors, the woods, wildlife, and a sense of peace that you just can't get in the city. We wanted to enjoy the outdoors, unplug from our devices, and reconnect with nature. After a day of hiking and fun, we set up camp in a beautiful clearing, surrounded by huge trees. The sun got low, so we started a small campfire and shared stories. We were laughing and reminiscing about our childhood. The night was calm and amazing at first. We were having such a good time. But very quickly, things went south. A little after midnight, Emily and I decided to call it a night. We threw some water on the fire and headed to our tents, each one only a few feet apart from the other. Inside my tent, I wished Emily a good night and closed my eyes. I don't know how much time went by, but shortly after I dozed off, I woke up when I started hearing noises from the wood line. At first, it was like a grunting noise. I told myself to chill and that it was probably a deer or something. Maybe it was a deer snort rather than a grunt. Well, that instantly changed when the grunts turned to growls. Low, guttural growls. Whatever it was sounded absolutely massive. There was something else too that I noticed that I hadn't before when I first started hearing the grunts. It was completely silent. There was nothing. No crickets, no frogs, no bugs. Absolutely nothing. By this time, I'm pretty terrified now, and I start calling for Emily. She was wide awake too. I asked her if she was hearing the same thing that I was, and she said that she was. Neither of us knew what the hell to do. We were miles from anything and had nowhere to go. I told her I was coming over, and so I grabbed my phone and things and hurried over to her tent. Once I got over there, we went back and forth about what to do. We were out in the middle of nowhere and had absolutely no cell phone reception. The growls kept coming and they were getting louder. We started hearing branches breaking too. There was something out there. It sounded really large, and it seemed like it was pissed. We finally decided that we should get a fire going again. We just didn't know what else to do. Luckily, we still had a bunch of wood, and so we hopped out of the tent and got to work. I got a flashlight and started pointing it at the woods, but didn't see anything. Emily was working on the fire, and at first it was hard to get one going because we had dumped water on the previous one. But after some work, we finally got it going. I set my light down to grab more wood, and all of a sudden I looked over at Emily, and she was looking out at the wood line, and she was shaking, almost violently. I called out to her, but she was absolutely petrified. I kept asking her what it was and what was going on, but she couldn't say anything. Finally, she kind of motioned her head towards the woods and said, "There's something staring at us." I looked over at the wood line, and at first I didn't see anything, but then I saw it. It was a massive silhouette of something, and it looked like it was creeping behind a tree. When I say massive, I don't mean large. I mean it was absolutely massive. All I could make out was a shoulder, arm, and half of a head at first. It looked like it was hairy all over. And then it stepped out from the tree that it was behind. It was upright, completely covered in hair and on two legs. Its arms were unnaturally long and it looked like it had hands. It's hard to tell, but if I had to guess the height of what I was looking at, I would say that it had to have been between 8 and 9 feet tall. It's hard to describe in words just how big this thing was. What I'm about to say next is where I lose most people in the very few times that I've told this story. When it came out from behind the tree and looked at us, its eyes were glowing red. I swear on everything, they were glowing. It wasn't eye shine. They were glowing, and they were red. And I say it was a thing because it was not a man. The way it moved was so fluid that it couldn't be a man in a suit, and it was way too large. It went behind another tree, and for a moment it was completely silent. Nothing. And then we heard a blood-curdling scream. It was so loud and so powerful that both of us believed that we were going to die. Both of us gripped each other and started crying, almost uncontrollably, just shaking and crying and not knowing what to do. The thing was growling and moving around, and we could hear branches breaking all over. We stood there absolutely frozen. Then at some point during all of this, I snapped out of it. I came to the realization that we were out in the middle of nowhere and had nowhere to go. I looked at Emily and shook her a little bit to try to snap her out of it too. She looked at me and I said, "Listen, We need to get this fire going as much as possible. We need to make it big." She nodded, and I told her to start throwing more wood on it. So she started doing that, and I grabbed the flashlight again. I pointed it towards the wood line, but whatever it wasn't there anymore. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't where it was standing before. I don't know, but something told me that maybe the light will keep it away. And so that's what I did. I turned the flashlight on high beam and pointed it at the wood line. I started scanning the wood line back and forth, back and forth. I was terrified. If it wasn't where we had seen it earlier, where was it? Did it go back into the woods? Was it sneaking up on us? I didn't know, and that absolutely terrified me. I scanned all around the perimeter of our campsite and didn't see anything, so I at least felt like it wasn't sneaking up on us. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. All I could think to do was just keep fire and light going and wait it out, and then get the hell out of there as soon as there was daylight. And so that's what we did. For probably 3 hours we kept wood on the fire, and I kept constantly scanning the woods with my flashlight. During this time we continued to hear growls, rustling, and branches breaking. It seemed like the fire and the light were working, though. There were 2 other times that I saw glowing, or what I believed to be its eyes, in the woods. Both times it was at a distance, and both times they ducked out as soon as my flashlight hit them. Eventually, as the sun started coming up, the noises started retreating. There were fewer and fewer growls and fewer branch breaks. The sun finally topped out over the horizon, and we didn't hear anything else. When we were confident that whatever it was gone, we grabbed our phones and backpacks and headed out. We left the tents, fire, and everything else behind. We were probably about 4 miles out from the car, and so we made our way back as quickly as possible, scanning the woods as we went. When we finally got back to the car, we hopped in and drove away as fast as we could. We never returned for our tents and haven't been back since. After telling this story to a few close family and friends, it was clear that they thought we were crazy. They asked if we were drinking. They asked if we were doing drugs. And the answer to all of these questions has always been no. And so eventually we quit telling this story to everyone. To this day, I don't know what it was that we saw that night, but I do know for certain that there is something absolutely terrifying out there, and Emily and I will never venture out into those woods ever again at night. That's my story. It happened, and nobody will ever convince me that I didn't see what I saw or experience what I experienced. Story 5. Emma's Friend. Moving to an old farmhouse in Lockwood, Missouri, was supposed to be a fresh start for our family of 4. After my husband lost his job, the sudden inheritance of the property from his great-aunt seemed like a serendipitous gift. The land sprawled over a couple of acres, with the house looking like something out of an old-time movie, complete with a rickety fence and a swing set in the backyard. The moment we moved in, little Emma, our 3-year-old, was drawn to that swing set like a moth to a flame. I remember her excited shouts, "Mom, look, a swing!" We laughed, letting her tire herself out as she merrily pushed her imaginary friend on the swing. It was harmless, we thought. Within days, she started referring to her imaginary friend as the little girl. At breakfast, she'd narrate tales of how the little girl used to live in our house and would play on the swing every day. Honestly, we were more impressed by her creativity than concerned. Kids do have vivid imaginations after all. But then, strange things started happening. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found all the chairs overturned. When I asked Emma, she shrugged and whispered, "The little girl did it. She's unhappy." I assumed Emma was testing boundaries, a phase perhaps. However, our stay in Lockwood quickly devolved from peaceful to eerie. Lights would suddenly flicker. Doors would slam unexpectedly. On one unsettling evening, as I made my way to the basement to fetch some old toys, The door slammed behind me. I wrestled with the knob, but found myself trapped. It felt like forever down there until my husband heard my panicked shouts and rescued me. Emma, looking up from her drawings, simply remarked, "She doesn't want you here." As days passed, my earlier amusement with Emma's tales turned to dread. My eldest son, Mike, also grew wary. He confessed to hearing footsteps outside his room at night. Yet, it was an incident with my husband that convinced us something was very wrong. It was a crisp morning, and I watched from the kitchen as he walked upstairs. Minutes later, I heard a horrified scream and a thud. Turning around, I found him sprawled at the foot of the staircase, clutching his leg. He looked at me, terror in his eyes. "Someone pushed me, I swear." It was then that our attempts to rationalize everything ceased. We decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. The town's local librarian helped us find old newspaper clippings about the property. A chilling revelation awaited us. 70 years ago, a young girl had tragically passed away in a house fire right where our home stood. She loved playing on the swing set. We couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Even Emma became withdrawn, repeatedly saying, "The little girl is unhappy that we're living in her house." But nothing could have prepared us for one fateful night. Awoken by a strong smell of smoke, we found the house engulfed in flames. Panic set in. Racing to Emma's room, we found her calmly sitting on her bed. "I warned you," she whispered. "The little girl said it's too late." Desperately, we tried to exit, but none of the doors would budge. It's like they were all locked from the outside, trapping us in. The heat intensified, and our hope dwindled. But in that dire moment, adrenaline kicked in. My husband, in a Herculean effort, shattered a living room window with a chair, creating an escape route. The cold night air was a stark contrast to the scalding heat inside. We watched our supposed fresh start turn to ashes. The haunting silhouette of the swing set was the only thing left unscathed in the backyard. As dawn broke, we decided unanimously we wouldn't return. Whatever memories the house held, they weren't ours to keep. We were just grateful to have made it out alive. Today, all that remains of our short stay in Lockwood is scarred memories and Emma's innocent words. "She doesn't want you here." If only we had listened sooner.
Story 6. I live to tell about the Jersey Devil. The story I'm sharing with you happened to me a few years ago in the New Jersey Pinelands. Hunting season had just opened up, and I couldn't have been more excited about it. I've been a hunter all my life, and I was eager to get out and do the thing I loved. I headed out early so I could get to my spot before the sun started coming up. I had been in this spot before and felt that it had good potential. I found a nice tree, settled up against it, and as normal hunts go, I waited. A few hours passed as I watched and listened to the forest around me. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds and squirrels, and everything seemed normal. As the day wore on, I began to grow restless. I'd been in this spot for quite a while and hadn't seen or heard anything yet. I was just about ready to call it a day when I began to hear some motion behind me. It sounded like it was moving up towards me, so rather than turning around, I waited to see if it would come up and around into my field of view. Whatever it was sounded like it was on 4 legs. After all these years, the thrill of the hunt still excited me. I figured it was what I had come for, so I waited, my heart beginning to pound with anticipation. The steps were getting closer, and they seemed to be moving up from behind me and to my left. When I felt like it was close enough, and within my field of view, I slowly turned my head and strained to see through some underbrush and deadfall. At first, I could see some movement but couldn't make out any fine details. It was black in color, but that's about all that I could see. I wasn't sure yet what it was, but it definitely wasn't a deer. Maybe a black bear? Confusion started to settle in. Whatever it was down low. Then, it started making some noises. Sounds that I would describe as unnatural. They weren't loud, but they weren't like anything I've heard before. At least not in the woods. The best I could describe them as is the sounds that a baby would make. Kind of like a cackle and a grunt mixed together. Again, very difficult to describe, and very creepy. Then it rose up. Honestly, my first thought was to think to myself, wait, is that a horse? It was definitely black, and looked like it had a horse's head. So many thoughts went through my head in a fraction of a second. Is it a horse? What is a horse doing out here? Is that thing up on two legs? What in the hell am I looking at? The details of this thing began rushing in. It was still covered by some deadfall and brush, but I could now see from its lower chest up. The way it was positioned, it had to be standing on two legs. It was absolutely hideous. It looked like it had horns and it was sniffing at the air. It looked like it didn't have any hair, and its eyes were just as dark as its skin. I was absolutely frozen and terrified. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it hadn't yet seen me, and I was praying that it wouldn't. Luckily, I was downwind, and it was looking away from me. After a few sniffs, it dropped back down. It seemed to meander behind the brush for what felt like an eternity, and then it seemed to turn and walk back the way it came in. When I believed that it was turning back, I swear I saw a tail flick in the air. I don't know what else it could have been. I sat there, motionless, listening as it walked back deeper into the forest. After not hearing anything for a few moments, I gathered my things and hurried my way out of there as quickly as possible. When I got home, I told my wife. "Sounds like you saw the Jersey Devil," she said with a skeptical look. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I never saw wings, or the full body, or anything like that. But of the parts that I did see, it definitely matches up with other accounts of what others would call the Jersey Devil. I don't go into the woods as much as I used to, and if I were being honest with myself, I would say that the encounter has a lot to do with that. I don't know for certain what I saw that day, but I do know with certainty that there is something out there that shouldn't exist. Story 7. The House That Hid Secrets. The tale I'm about to share is not for the faint of heart. It's a nightmare that still haunts my dreams, one that unfolded within the walls of our very own beautiful home. My wife and I were newlyweds, excited with the prospect of moving into a historical home. It was a magnificent 1920s architectural masterpiece that exuded a peculiar charm. It was a sanctuary for our dreams, a place to hold us as we grew together, or so we thought. What we would soon discover, however, was that there was something in our home more terrifying than any ghost story I could have ever imagined. In the beginning, our new home was everything that we could have possibly hoped for, a home built from the era of the Roaring '20s. We were so in love with it, so much so that we became blissfully ignorant of the malevolence lurking in its corners. As the days and weeks went by, an uneasy tension seemed to build and emanate from the house itself. It seemed to watch and wait, savoring our vulnerability. Each night we heard faint, muffled whispers that we could never quite decipher. We blamed it on the old house's quirks and tried to ignore the growing unease that began to gnaw at us. An unease that reached a turning point on a frigid, moonless night. I was home alone, my wife away visiting family. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. An eerie, inexplicable force had taken hold of me, calling me towards the attic, inviting me to examine its hidden mysteries and secrets, an invitation that I would accept, hoping to dispel my irrational fears. Until this point, the excitement of our new marriage and the bliss of our new home had occupied our attention, causing us to neglect the attic, which now beckoned with an unsettling urgency. Ascending the creaky stairs, I couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that pressed down on me. Dust motes swirled in the dim light as I opened the attic door. The air grew cold, as if the house itself knew of the sinister secret lurking within. The attic was a desolate wasteland of forgotten belongings, a time capsule from decades past. It was as if the attic had been frozen in time, its contents untouched by the passage of years. Old trunks and suitcases draped in cobwebs lined the perimeter of the dimly lit space, their leather and canvas exteriors weathered by years of neglect. The air was thick with the musty scent of aged paper and memories long gone. Antique furniture, draped in dusty sheets, stood sentinel in the attic's corners, while forgotten family heirlooms gathered dust on wooden shelves. Faded photographs, some yellowed with age, stared back at me from cracked frames, their subjects forever captured in moments of the past. Having felt that I had thoroughly investigated the attic and its hidden mysteries, I turned to retreat back down to the lower levels. As I began to turn, something came over me, compelling me to investigate the farthest corner of the attic. As I inched closer, I noticed a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. With trembling hands, I pulled it aside, revealing a secret room. What I found inside was a chamber of horrors. The room was adorned with macabre symbols and covered in sinister writings. A tattered mattress was stained with something that looked eerily like blood. My heart pounded in my chest as a dark realization washed over me. This room was a shrine to darkness, a place where unspeakable rituals had taken place. Fear clawed at me as I fled from the attic and contacted the authorities. Armed with flashlights that cut through the inky darkness, the officers approached the tattered curtain, pushing it aside to unveil the oppressive room, just as I had done before. What they found, and what I had failed to find, was a hidden door, a portal to the rooftop and the outside world. Just a short distance away, a tree, providing the necessary means to ascend and descend from the secret doorway. The discovery bore down on me like a ton of bricks. It seemed that an intruder had been using this secret passage to gain access to our home, creeping in and out like a phantom under the cover of darkness, performing disturbing rituals just above our unsuspecting heads. My thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. How could we have missed this? How could we have never seen the door from the outside? How could we have never inspected the attic before moving in? I tried to comfort myself, telling myself that this would have slipped by anyone. The doorway was camouflaged too well on the outside. Anyone would have missed it, right? The most unsettling revelation, however, had yet to come to light. On the floor of the concealed room, amidst discarded food wrappers, rested a diary. It belonged to the attic dweller. Within its pages lay not only an obsession with my wife and me, but also a malevolent intent to seize our lives for the sake of sinister rituals. The diary was brimming with ominous incantations and chilling drawings of my wife and me, rendered in nightmarish and distorted forms. A meticulous and urgent investigation of the house ensued. We relentlessly searched for any trace of the elusive attic dweller. Despite our efforts, the unwelcomed guest was never found that night, or any other night after. He had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an unsettling sense of uncertainty that would haunt us for years to come. As I share this harrowing experience with you, I can still feel the oppressive weight of that house on my shoulders. The evil that resided within those walls was real, a force that had been watching, waiting, and plotting. The memory of that house serves as a dark reminder that even the most beautiful homes can harbor the darkest of nightmares. At times, the most frightening stories aren't confined to books or movies, but are rather concealed within the very walls of our own homes.
Story 8. The Dying Light of the Park. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the lively park as I brought the children to play. The park was teeming with life, children laughing, dogs frolicking, and parents chatting. But as the latecomers, I found the children and I parked further from the park's bustling center than I would have liked. The children's excitement was palpable as we joined the throng of people enjoying the vibrant setting. We spent hours playing, laughing, and making memories, the world around us alive with the joy of shared experiences. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a subtle shift occurred. Families began to gather their belongings and depart, leaving us alone amidst the fading light. Suddenly, the park that had felt so welcoming began to feel eerie and desolate. The laughter of children faded into the distance, replaced by the unsettling rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I could sense a growing unease, a feeling that we were intruders in a place that had transformed into something far more sinister as the day waned. As the children's play grew quieter, my eyes were drawn to the edge of the park, where the trees loomed like sentinels against the dying light. There, amidst the shadows, stood a mysterious figure, its form barely discernible. It seemed to watch us with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine, its gaze unrelenting as the darkness deepened. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, and I urged the children to gather their things so we could leave. But the path back to the car was elusive, and what had once been a vibrant park now felt like a labyrinth of uncertainty. Panic began to set in as the woods seemed to close in around us, the ominous figure still lingering at the edge of our vision. The children's laughter had turned to terrified screams as we stumbled through the darkness, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure seemed to shadow our every move, its eyes glowing like malevolent beacons in the night. The woods seemed to whisper with secrets that only intensified our fear. Desperation fueled our steps as we retraced our path, the darkness making it impossible to discern landmarks. The figure's presence crept closer, its sinister aura a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. With every breath, every heartbeat, the feeling of impending doom grew stronger. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a break in the trees revealed the faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. We raced toward the car, our breathless gasps punctuating the silence of the night. As the children scrambled into the vehicle, I leaped into the driver's seat and glanced out the window one last time. There, just a few feet away, stood the figure, its devious eyes locked onto mine. It laughed, a chilling sound that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its heavy breaths hung in the air, a sinister reminder of the danger we had narrowly escaped. With trembling hands, I started the car and sped away, the park's desolate emptiness fading into the distance. The weight of the encounter would forever haunt us, a reminder that even in the most familiar of places, darkness and danger could lurk just beyond the light's reach.
Story 9. A horrific camping story. Solitude, they say, offers serenity. For my wife and me, the heart's truest peace was found away from the hum and hustle of city life. Our isolated adventures, as we lovingly called them, were our sanctuaries. A way to unplug from social life, society, and obligations, and plug into nature, the earth, and its beautiful scenery. That would all change through one fateful weekend, on an isolate strip of beach in Northern California. Our decision to venture to this reclusive spot was influenced by whispers of its untouched beauty. Nestled away from the well-trodden tourist trails, it was said to be a place where you could hear the earth breathe. Accessible only through a narrow, winding path covered by overarching trees, it seemed the perfect locale for our next escapade. On our arrival, the place did more than live up to its reputation. The vast expanse of golden sands, untouched by footprints, stretched out invitingly before us. Distant cliffs stood tall, silently watching over the beach, their faces eroded by time and weather. The hypnotic sound of waves kissing the shoreline felt like nature's own lullaby. With great enthusiasm, we set up our little campsite near a cluster of rocks, providing us with a vantage point of the vast ocean. We gathered driftwood, kindling a fire whose flames danced merrily against the darkening canvas of the sky. As night descended, the universe unveiled its majesty. A blanket of stars glittered above, their twinkle reflected in the shimmering waters below. Hand in hand, we lay on the sand, allowing the tranquility to envelop us. This was the stuff that dreams were made of. Life just couldn't get any better. Having soaked up every ounce of beauty and nature that we could that day, we extinguished our fire, retired to the tent, and settled in to sleep. All was well, until it happened. In the dead of the night, we were awakened by a piercing, blood-curdling scream that ripped through our tent. Both my wife and I shot straight up, like we were yanked from the ground by a cord. "What was that?" my wife said as she grabbed my arm, gripping me with the force of a steel clamp. "I don't know," I whispered. For a moment, an eerie silence prevailed. The once hypnotic sound of the waves, which had resembled a lullaby, had now taken a turn and seemed to usher in something ominous. The ensuing moments stretched on endlessly. We strained our ears, desperate to catch any other sounds. Our eyes were wide open, every muscle frozen, hoping to remain unseen even within the cover of our tent. Gathering some courage, I cautiously leaned forward and unzipped the tent's entrance just a crack, allowing myself a narrow vantage point to survey the outside. As I did, my wife's hand moved slowly towards a flashlight, but just as she was about to switch it on, I grabbed it. "Wait," I whispered. "I see something." In the distance, a faint glow hovered just above the water's surface, slightly to the east. I squinted, trying to discern its nature. What was it? Was it an orb? Perhaps some odd reflection? My speculations were abruptly interrupted as a second light blazed into life. It was unmistakably a flashlight, a powerful one, emanating from a boat. Its beam crawled back and forth slowly, against the very shoreline that we were occupying. The light inched towards us, steadily narrowing the distance. It was a beam with malicious intent, like a snake slithering across the shoreline, looking for prey. "What the hell?" I whispered, unintentionally sending my wife into a panic. "What is it? What's happening?" she asked. Her words fell on deaf ears, my entire focus riveted on the rapidly encroaching beam. My heart began to pound faster and faster. It was just feet away now, inching closer and closer, threatening to reveal our presence on this supposedly deserted stretch of beach. I squinted, expecting to be blinded by the onslaught of light emanating from this boat. But then, just as we were about to be exposed, it abruptly went dark. A voice floated from the distance, barely discernible. "We're clear," the voice said. For a fleeting moment, everything went still again. My breath caught in my throat, and my teeth clenched as I cautiously unzipped the tent further to get a better look. Beside me, my wife craned her neck, her eyes stretched wide and unblinking, attempting to get a look herself. Those few seconds felt endless. Our attention locked onto the boat, hoping to gather additional details to try to better decipher what was going on. Then, jarring the stillness, a motor roared to life. The sound was coming from the boat, but it wasn't the boat's motor, it was something else. It sounded smaller, but powerful nonetheless. The motor's noise oscillated, screaming loudly as if it was being throttled, then idling only to scream again and then idle back down. It did this, repeatedly, dozens of times. "Hurry up!" A voice, deep and menacing, could be heard between the intervals in the motor's screams. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the motor went silent. Questions swirled in my mind. What were they up to? Why were they operating under such secrecy in the middle of the ocean, shielded by the cover of night? And then, plopping sounds, as if sizable chunks of something were being dumped into the water. My wife and I looked at each other, desperately searching for answers. Every moment brought more and more confusion. Suddenly, a dark voice queried, its tone echoing over the water. "Are we good?" Another voice responded, "Yeah." "Good," the first voice replied. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Our eyes strained as we caught glimpses of hurried, deliberate movement. Then, the motor once again roared to life. This time, it was the sound of the boat's engine. We watched as the silhouette of the boat began to move, heading off to the east. It grew smaller and smaller, as did the sound of its engine, until they were both finally gone. My wife and I just looked at each other. "What just happened?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but whatever it is, and whoever they were, they're gone now." She nodded in agreement, but still had a slight look of concern on her face. "Try to get some sleep," I said to her. "We'll get up and out of here at first light." She agreed and settled back in. I zipped the door back up, settled back in, and closed my eyes as my wife cuddled up against me. I listened to the sound of the ocean, a sweet lullaby once again, and slowly dozed back off to sleep. All was well. The dark presence that lurked in the ocean was gone, and the tranquility of nature once again enveloped us. That is, until I heard another blood-curdling scream. This time, when I darted up, it was daylight outside. I looked over, and my wife was gone. I yelled for her, only to hear another piercing scream. I threw off my blanket and unzipped the tent. As I took my first step out onto the sandy beach, I was met with yet another scream. This time I could tell where it was coming from. It was my wife. She had gotten up before I did and started a fire to boil some water for coffee. As she was waiting for the fire to grow, she looked over and saw something wash up on shore. It was a foot, a human foot, and it wasn't attached to a body. She was hysterical, as she had every right to be. I was overcome with terror myself, but tried to hold it together for the both of us. I tried to comfort her. It's okay, I said. You're okay. I quickly ushered her over to the tent. Just stay in here, I said. I'm calling the police now. She nodded her head up and down as she struggled to breathe, her eyes pouring tears now. I looked down at my phone. I could barely dial 911 because my hands were shaking so badly. Within minutes, the first wave of police officers arrived, then the patrol boats, and finally the helicopters, both law enforcement and media. There was a chaotic whirlwind of activity. Over the coming hours, more body parts would wash up. First an arm, then a leg, and then another foot. 2 days later, a dive team would eventually recover the head. The roar of the little motor that we had heard the night before, it became evident, was that of a chainsaw, making small work of its victim to be thrown to the ocean. The coming months were a nightmare for my wife and me. We were questioned by the police multiple times. Like a press bearing down on us, they did everything that they could to extract every detail of information that we had to offer. It was difficult, but we understood that it was necessary. Eventually it paid off and arrests were made. A bad business deal, it seems, was the motive. So sad. Outings for my wife and me were never the same. Our isolated adventures had lost their magic. Having given way to the ominous memories of our beach getaway, they became fewer and farther between. Questions from that night still linger in my mind. What if that beam of light had made its way over just a few more feet? We would have been discovered, and then what? Would we have been victims too? Or would our presence have stopped the events of that night from unfolding altogether? That isolated stretch of beach may hold those answers forever. As for my wife and I, we're doing our best to forge new memories. We're doing our best to let the waves of the past recede, while focusing on the horizons of our future.
Story 10. Horror in the Sorority House. Halloween, the holiday I cherished above all others, had always held a special place in my heart. My childhood was marked by delightful memories of trick-or-treating, but now, as a grown-up faced with adult decisions, my Halloween traditions had evolved. A few years ago, I was a college student in a sorority, anticipating the grandest party of the year. My sisters and I were all eagerly awaiting the arrival of the spookiest holiday, eager to celebrate it in style. Little did I realize that this Halloween would forever destroy my feelings toward this once-beloved holiday. The day had been a whirlwind of excitement. We spent hours getting dressed in our elaborate costumes, carefully applying makeup and doing our hair. Laughter filled the air as we helped each other perfect our looks. But as the clock ticked away, a dreadful realization had come over me. I had yet to finish a critical paper for my criminal law class that was due the next morning. I was crushed. In the hustle and bustle of the day, I had completely forgotten about it. Dutifully, I decided to stay behind while my sisters went to the party. I was all alone in our sorority house, and the ambiance was eerie. The old Victorian building creaked with every gust of wind, and the dimly lit hallways seemed to stretch on forever. I settled into our common room, surrounded by the silence that was only interrupted by the occasional distant laughter from the partygoers traversing the street outside. I sighed, preparing to focus on my paper and make the most of the solitude. Hours passed, and the only company I had was the eerie silence that had enveloped the house. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower than usual, as if time itself had conspired against me. There was a thick, ominous aura in the air. It was a dreadful feeling, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. As I was engrossed in my work, I heard what I believed to be a muffled scream and a thud. My heart raced as I was sure that I was the only one in the house. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild, trying to scare me on Halloween night. Then, I began to hear creaks in the floorboards, and they seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside the common room. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My instincts told me that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Suddenly, the door to the common room slowly swung open, and what I witnessed next will forever be burned into my memory. In the doorway loomed a dark figure, cloaked in shadows, his eyes glowing with sinister intentions. My heart raced as his piercing gaze locked onto me, freezing me in place. The silence was deafening, only to finally be broken by 3 words that slithered out of the stranger's mouth. "Trick or treat," the figure said. I began shaking uncontrollably. Just as the terror of this figure threatened to engulf me entirely, salvation arrived in an unexpected form. My sorority sisters returned from their night of revelry, their voices echoing through the house. The figure in the doorway seemed displeased, his sinister plans foiled by this unexpected intrusion. In a hurried escape, he turned and bolted down the hallway. Ignited by an adrenaline-fueled urgency, I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, torn between the desperate desire to chase down the mysterious figure and the need to alert my sorority sisters to the impending danger. My pursuit was abruptly halted when I stumbled over an unforeseen obstruction on the floor. My trembling hands quickly found the lifeless body of one of my sisters sprawled on the floor, her once vibrant form now immersed in a chilling pool of crimson. A shudder of horror coursed through me, its icy grip intensifying as the dreadful reality of the night's gruesome events sank in. I screamed, and that was the last thing that I remembered from that terrible night. I had lost consciousness, and the next fragment of memory that I could grasp was awakening inside a hospital. The authorities were called, and a meticulous investigation into the night's harrowing events unfolded. Yet, despite their efforts, the identity of the malevolent intruder was never found. For a long time, I wrestled with the chilling thought that I had been the next target on his list. Halloween, a day I had always cherished for its excitement and joy, took an unexpected turn, becoming an occasion that I would come to dread for the rest of my life.
Story 11. A terrifying tale of isolation. This unsettling narrative takes root in a journey that began with excitement and the allure of the unknown, alongside an 8-man crew. However, destiny led me to be the sole survivor, stranded on a remote, deserted island. As the waves relentlessly pounded the ship's hull, a storm of unexpected magnitude erupted, a tempest that rendered the vessel and its crew helpless against nature's fury. Amid the chaos of the storm, the ship was tossed with relentless force by towering waves. Each crash carried an unmistakable weight, underscoring the insignificance of human endeavors when pitted against the forces of nature. The ship groaned and shuddered as if it were protesting its fate, and as day broke, the vessel found itself grounded on the unforgiving shores of an isolated island, with me as the sole survivor. The sun ascended with blistering intensity, casting harsh shadows that stretched across the barren landscape. What had begun as a promising adventure had deteriorated into a nightmare of solitude, accentuated by the absence of the crew's camaraderie. The island, its pale sands contrasting with the gnarled vegetation, extended in all directions, a stark manifestation of nature's capriciousness. The air hung heavy with a silence that seemed to envelop everything, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the mysteries concealed within the island's terrain. Days merged into nights, each one a repetitive cycle of isolation and a yearning for escape. I ventured along the shoreline, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of life, a glimmer of hope that remained frustratingly elusive. The waves persisted in their relentless assault on the shore, a ceaseless echo of the world beyond the island's edge. Yet the island itself remained void of visible activity, its silence an overwhelming presence. With the sun's descent, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The harsh shadows that danced across the landscape seemed to morph into a living entity, casting an eerie spell over the surroundings. Every rustle of leaves or distant sound carried a sense of significance, as if the island held secrets waiting to be unearthed. During the nights, I took refuge in a makeshift shelter, my thoughts reverberating like the waves that crashed against the shore. The island's aura seemed to intensify in the darkness, and a persistent notion emerged that I wasn't truly alone, that unseen eyes observed me from the shadows, that the island's mysteries were aware and observing. As time passed, the days melted into weeks, marked only by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. The island's desolation became a constant companion, and the silence that pervaded it transformed into a symphony of unanswered questions. Was this place genuinely deserted, or were secrets concealed beyond the veil of my perception? With each passing day, my desperation grew, igniting an urgent need to break free from the island's clutches. I searched tirelessly for any signs of deliverance, hoping to spot a ship on the horizon or the silhouette of a passing aircraft. Yet each day only revealed the same barren landscape and the unyielding waves. The island's isolation draped over me like a heavy shroud, a haunting testimony to the fragility of human existence amidst nature's vast expanse. As I stared out into the endless expanse of the ocean, I couldn't help but wonder if rescue would ever come. The isolation and solitude pressed upon me, leaving me grappling with the uncertainty of my fate. Would I ever be found, or would the island's silence become my eternal companion? Thanks for tuning into another episode from the Alley of Nightmares. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, subscribe, and share with all your friends. Until next time,